Tell me about an investment system that really transformed your classroom.
So my student jobs really turned things around in my classroom. There were a few jobs that really worked. So the checks for understanding person basically read out all my questions and then pulled a name. So the people that they called on would be random.
You put these questions in a PowerPoint so they would know what question to ask.
They were either on a poster or on a PowerPoint, and then they were color coded for difficulty. I had 3 questions, 3 levels: high, low, medium.
Perfect.
And so all these were introduced in probably about October, all these jobs. Line boss, make sure that the line looks right.
Line boss wasn't allowed to talk.
No, line boss had to use only nonverbal cues. Like,
Made sure the line was quiet and straight.
mm-hmm.
So checks for understanding master, line boss.
And the most effective one, the one that made the most change in my classroom, was class boss, which is the student leader with the most responsibility in the classroom. They would lead morning meeting. There would be a PowerPoint, and they would read off everything in the PowerPoint. They would narrate when students had good behavior and give out values points if they felt that they needed them. They also could correct bad behavior from time to time. Kind of depended on the student, but for some that really worked. I'd ask them for advice if I was having trouble. They also led all of the transitions and most of the procedures, and they decided whether we received class points or not.
How did you teach the class boss how to narrate?
It's funny, I think I only taught one class boss how to narrate, and then after that they just sort of caught on. But I taught them by showing them that basically you don't narrate bad behavior. Narrating is about basically like an ongoing shout out. It's about saying who's doing well and saying what they're doing well, and it's also about varying that, so you don't always say this person's doing this great and then say the same thing for next person, but you notice what they individually are doing well.
Did you ever have trouble with students narrating bad behavior, or did they usually focus on the positive?
I did have a little bit of trouble with that sometimes. I think I had to fire a class boss for doing that over and over again, but usually they caught on, mostly just because I would remind them that, we're not pessimists, we're optimists, and we want to focus on the good behavior, not the bad behavior. That gives our friends who have bad behavior the chance to correct themselves.
So just to sum up, class boss ran morning and afternoon meeting with goal setting.
Mm-hmm.
They narrated student behavior and gave out values points. They would sometimes correct student behavior if you gave them that responsibility. They lined this class up and they brought the class to the carpet, and then they decided whether class points were earned during transitions or not, giving their reasons. Yes, we earned a class point because, or no, we did not because.
Mm-hmm.
And was this job for the day, the week, the month?
Oh, it's for the week. All of my jobs were for the week, and jobs had to be earned via good behavior.
So did everyone have the opportunity to be a class boss?
No. Class bosses had to be strong readers. They had to be really responsible and trustworthy. They had to be quick as well. So class boss, I would say that only a few students I really trusted to do a great job being class boss, but there were jobs for other students who weren't qualified to do that as well.
Did any student ever ask to be class boss and you told them no?
Yep.
How did that go?
Went okay. I mean, I was just being totally honest. It's as if it's in any job situation, if you're not qualified for the job, then you can't do the job. And I think I told them something similar. I said, you've lied to me before, and my class boss has to be really honest because that's part of their job. So if you've lied to me, then I can't trust you to be class boss. And they just said, okay.
But were they motivated by other jobs?
Yeah.
Tell me about a student that you didn't trust to be class boss at the beginning and then you changed your mind, and why?
One of my students, oh, one of my students came to me in October, say Sean, and he was just really mean. He was so poorly behaved. He would lie all the time, but he was not a very good liar, so it was also really obvious whenever he lied. He was really dishonest. He was extremely disruptive. But I think what turned things around for him and what made him ultimately one of the best class bosses at the end of the year is me letting him know that he could not be class boss, and me also letting him know that he couldn't do any other job because he had zero responsibility. He took no responsibility. So I had that talk with him, and then he got really upset about it, but I realized he was just upset because he really did want that responsibility and he wanted to be a leader, but he just needed to, prove it. He needed to prove it to me, and it took him a month or two to earn my trust back, and he would always ask, Ms. Yerkes, do I have your trust yet? And usually the answer was no. But eventually, for a whole month, he was really honest. He made some mistakes, he slipped up, but he was doing much better in general. And so I did change my mind, and I made him class boss a lot in the last 3 or 4 months of school, and he did a really great job.
Tell me about your investment system of students rating themselves and their behavior during centers or after transition or on their class goal.
So I had students do like a rock, paper, scissors almost, but you do rock, paper, scissors and then give yourself a rating from 0 to 5. And it's pretty self-explanatory. 5 is I am doing an outstanding job. 0 is I have not followed any directions. I'm doing a really awful job. And I expected them to not be as honest as they actually were. They were pretty brutally honest with themselves. And that was really helpful during transitions, because if kids were off track, we could do a quick rating. And then I would have them whisper to a friend, okay, if you're at a 0, a 1, 2, or a 3, then you need to tell your friends something that you're going to do to get back to a 4 or a 5. Or that's also a chance to celebrate the 4s and 5s who have...
Your reward system at the beginning of the year and what it evolved into and why.
So at the beginning of the year, I started with table points and whole class points. I continued to use table points throughout the year because I felt that it kept people accountable for their team. I decided to change my whole class point because some students were getting angry at the students that were misbehaving, and further, it was not as consistent as I wanted it to be. So about halfway through the year, I decided to change and do table points and individual points. This kept the students much more invested in, keeping with our values all throughout the day. If they got a certain amount of personal points, then they were able to earn a stick back. I also allocated different jobs throughout the classroom based on how many personal points they had.
Would you give the points off of the values or just in general?
There was multiple things. I wanted it to be for people that went above and beyond, who were always using kind words, going along with our values, leadership, respect, self-control, and pride, and that were showing grit.
What did you find after you switched to individual points from whole class points?
I found that those students who were harder to reach at the beginning of the year were becoming way more invested in doing their best throughout the day, and it created a more positive culture in my classroom.
So you'd recommend individual points over whole class points to anyone who is trying to decide on a reward system?
Yes, I would.
Tell me a little bit about your table points. What would they earn table points for, and what rewards did you use for your table points?
With table points, there was timing, transitions, who could do their transition the quickest, who could do their transition the most silent, who did their independent practice well, who was able to clean up their table. Sometimes when I saw tables being kind to each other and showing good values within their team, they would earn table points. At the end of the week, the first place table got to pick out of a treasure box, and the second place table got a piece of candy.
Excellent. And then one last question about the individual value points. You mentioned that they had class jobs as the incentive for whoever had the most points got to choose jobs. Did you have any other rewards or incentives attached to the values points, or was it pretty much just the jobs?
There was the jobs, and then there was also, you could earn a stick back if you had 5 personal points, and that goes along with my consequence system. I had Also, you could put their name when students got shout out for values. Then I would put their name on the values board, and the person at the end of the week who had the most shout out for their values would get a prize.
Awesome. Thank you. Tell me about your reward system at the beginning of the year and what it changed and evolved into and why.
So at the beginning of the year, I had whole group points. Was my main focus. So like whenever the class would get into ready position quickly or get in line quickly or do certain things, the whole class would get a point, and if they earned 25 points, they would have Friday fun. I also had group points, which I'm not going to get into because that didn't change that much. As the year went on, I realized that a lot of the students weren't really invested in the group points because they would be doing everything exactly as I asked and wouldn't be getting rewarded or would be getting consequences for it, even though because the rest of the class wasn't following directions. And so I found a lot of kids stop caring about the whole group points. And also then at the end of the week when we were having our Friday fun, there were students who shouldn't have earned Friday fun still participating, so it wasn't really working for me. So I switched to individual points that were not connected to the consequences. They're completely separate because I also felt that I wanted my kids to be working for points rather than not getting...
Trying to erase consequences.
Right. Exactly. So now it's also on my clipboard with my consequences. I have individual points, and they can get points for showing their values.
What are your team values?
Independence, teamwork, love, and grit. So if I see somebody working really hard when other people have given up, I'll give a point, or when they're helping a friend without me asking. If they're in ready position, even though the rest of the class is being disruptive, things like that. And they have to earn a certain amount of points to get Friday fun. And then if they get more points, they get a prize from the prize box. More points than that, they get to choose a book for dear time and read it to the class. And the most points is 20 points, and then they can sit in my chair for a day, which they love. So I felt that individual points has worked a lot better because they seem to be a lot more invested in it because they're working for it on their own. My group points, so they're not sitting in groups anymore, but they were sitting in groups of 6 and 4, and if they had kept all their pencils, because pencils are a huge issue, they would get to take their shoes off at the end of the day. So that's how my group points would work.
The prizes you talked about for individual points, the sitting in the chair and the choosing a book for dear time and reading it to the class, are those weekly points or daily points or both?
So the daily points, students who have the most points at the end of the morning, they get to be line leader. Students who have the most points at the end of the day get to have my pillow during dear time or the teddy bear. And at the end of the week, those points go towards Friday fun, prizes, and sitting in my chair and choosing a book for dear time.
Can you tell me about 1 or 2 students that individual points really worked for and why, and what you noticed happen when you switched to individual points?
I noticed that individual points worked really, really well for some of my lower students who had a lack of confidence in terms of their ability in academics. So one student, Delaney, really struggled in the beginning of the year with his behavior because he lacked confidence and was behind in everything. But when we started doing individual points, I noticed him like always sitting in ready position, trying to earn as many points so that he could be the line leader, things that you don't need to necessarily be strong academically, but he could prove himself through his behavior.
Tell me about your consequence system at the beginning of the year.
My consequence system at the beginning of the year was that I had a behavior chart in the front of my classroom, and each student has 5 popsicle sticks, and for each consequence that they get, a popsicle stick gets pulled out. And at the end of the day, however many popsicle sticks they had left, or the amount of points that they would get towards the end of the week or whatever.
How did this system evolve and change as the year went on, and why?
I realized that it wasn't working for me very well because every time I'd have to give a consequence, I would have to either get up and pull a popsicle stick, or I would have to remember that I pulled a popsicle stick, or I'd write it down, and it just got really messy. So I switched to having a clipboard where I have the morning the afternoon, and then individual points, which is separate. So another problem with that was that I would have to replace all the popsicle sticks at the end of the afternoon, and that sometimes didn't happen.
At the beginning of the afternoon.
Yeah, before the
because you
afternoon
had
started.
2 separate behavior
Exactly.
grades.
So I have a behavior grade for the morning and the afternoon, and now with the clipboard, every time they get a consequence, I just mark it next to their name, and it's a lot easier to keep track of. And they know that they're getting a consequence because I tell them verbally, and I'm a lot more consistent with my consequences now because I have it on my body at all times, so I don't have to be moving to do it, because when that happens, then I stopped giving consequences altogether sometimes, which obviously wasn't very effective.
Any tips for a teacher who says they don't like carrying a clipboard?
I mean, that's something you just have to get used to. You can also have a student that carries it around for you and is your clipboard manager. I know people who have done that and it's worked wonderfully for them. And for some people, having it on the board does work.
The more you carry the clipboard, the more you
The
get used to it.
easier it gets. I still forget it sometimes, but it's a lot better than it was in the beginning of the year, or the beginning of the semester.
Tell me about your planning process and how it changed and evolved over the year.
So at the beginning of teaching 5th grade reading, I used a Ready Common Core, which is a workbook that the school gave us, and I just would give them a passage, an objective, and it was like just series of short passages, and I didn't feel like it was engaging the students, and it wasn't rigorous in the fact that like it was very short passages that they'd have to read and answer questions about, and so they weren't mastering the objectives that they needed to when it would come time to the ILEAP. So I moved towards doing a book, and we did because of Winn-Dixie, and it was better, it was more engaging, but I still was just asking them comprehension questions rather than having like an objective like inferring character traits or like character motive. So we're just like reading a chapter, answering questions about it. So the next book we did was Watson's Go to Birmingham, and with that I've been doing packets where they have an objective, and we'll do like, for this one we did explaining our evidence. So like we'll have a word of the day and we'll have an objective, and when we're doing the objective we'll be reading a chapter. And so like for this one we're explaining evidence, so like we have an answer, evidence, and then why that evidence supports our answer. So rather than like them just giving me evidence that they pulled out of the passage, like telling me why that evidence supports the answer and why this evidence is the best choice to answer the question, like about for this one, character actions.
What did you notice in your students' behavior and also the level of work and the quality of answers they were giving you when you switched from doing a passage with a couple questions every day to a book study with planned objectives for each chapter?
When we were doing just like reading a chapter and answering questions, the level of engagement was higher than Ready Common Core, but still like there's a lot of time for them to get off task. And it was, their answers were just like more like one sentence answers, like that are just like Winn-Dixie does this and that's it. But with this, they've been having to explain their evidence, having to give evidence, so their answers are more than one sentence. They know how to pull evidence, and they know that if they're going to give me an answer, it has to be followed by because, and like tell me why their answer is correct or why like a character does what they do. And their behavior with that has been much better because they've been able to feel more successful because it's broken down more into steps. I've been modeling it more on my Elmo, and just behavior improved a lot when they had more engaging, rigorous material.
What about the changes in your math instruction from last year to this year?
So last year I did my intro to new material and my guided practice using a PowerPoint. Everyone was at their seats. I did some problems for them, I modeled, and then I had them call out different answers for guided practice, and we went over some questions, and then I passed out a worksheet, which we did one together and they did one by themselves. I found that the kids were getting bored of PowerPoint and they weren't as invested in the lesson, and they also, a lot of times they would sort of doze off and not quite remember the material as well once it got to independent practice because they hadn't practiced by themselves in their seats. So this year I had them on the carpet much more, and we used a lot of anchor charts, which were very interactive with the students. So they could come up and they could write on the anchor charts and answer different questions, and then About halfway through the year, I started allowing them to have their own whiteboards on the carpet so that everyone was practicing together when we were doing our guided practice and our modeling, and I was able to check and see that everyone had the right answer before I moved on to the next question. I found that this improved student achievement, and they were way more invested when they were able to have their own whiteboards on the carpet and when they were involved in answering every question instead of just having one student answer a question.
Tell me about your reward system and how it evolved over the year and why.
So at the beginning of the year, it started off as being a big laminated sheet from A to F, and kids would start off with their clothespin on A, and for every mistake that they made, they would move down to B, C, D, and F. And with that came the consequences of losing 5 minutes of recess, and then losing all of recess, and then an F was like, pretty much you lost everything. You lose your class party, you lose all of recess, you get a call home, you lose your job, and you have to write an apology letter. But, and then I think the only real reward I had in that system was that they could move from A. If they were only on A, they could move up to Rainbow, which was one higher than A, and get a reward. But,
What was the reward they'd get on Rainbow?
so I never really had any prizes that I had to buy. They were all pretty much free rewards, and that's worked since the beginning of the year because I just decided I did not want to pay for that. So they could take their shoes off at the end of the day. They could read on the carpet, which they really love. They could, get a whisper phone at the end of the day. Sometimes they could get a sticker or like a tiny prize like that I already had. They could grab a pillow to read on, and sometimes they could read to a friend at the end of the day.
And then you introduced Double Rainbow. Tell me about that.
So Double Rainbow happened when I think I introduced that because there were just some kids really worked. Of my kids who were receiving rewards, there were two groups of them. You know, the kids who were well behaved and the kids who were just leaders in the classroom, and I felt that they deserved a little something more. So Double Rainbow was you could pick 2 rewards, and I gave away my posters that I had made as well. So often Double Rainbow was you could have a poster.
Like an anchor chart that you had made
like
for
an
the day.
anchor chart. Or when we got our guinea pigs, Double Rainbow was you could play with the guinea pigs.
So you had your consequence ladder, and then they could only move up to Rainbow or Double Rainbow if from A.
From A.
So what happened if a student was on B or C? They never had a chance to move to Rainbow or Double Rainbow.
Yeah, they didn't have a chance to move up there, and I saw that beginning to become a problem because some kids would just slip up at the beginning of the day, but then really turn things around later on, and so I thought that they did deserve a chance to earn a reward.
So what did you do? How did your system evolve?
So after the chart, I still had the chart for my consequences, but then the reward system broke apart from the consequences, both because I wanted to give kids who had just had a small mistake the chance to get back on track, and because I wanted to let my other students track other kids' behavior. So the reward system became a clipboard with all the students' names and then a little space for them to give them tally marks if they showed the class values. So they had to earn 3 tally marks in order to get a reward, and they could redeem those only if they had an A, B, or a C in behavior.
So the tally marks were for class values, so specific behaviors attached to the values, and if you earned 3, you earned a reward unless your clip was on D or F.
Yeah, so unless you were really horrible, then you you could get a reward. And I thought that was a good way to let my kids know that, you know, they can always learn from their mistakes. As long as they weren't horrible mistakes, they could always turn things around and learn from their mistakes.
So essentially your reward system and your consequence system were not attached anymore at all unless they were on D or F, and then they couldn't redeem their values points.
Yeah, they were separate.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, wait, one more question. how did you track the values points, and was that difficult? And how did you make sure you stayed consistent with that and had each student earn values points every day?
So the tracking my values was attached to my rewards, and on the clipboard has student's name and then values across the top.
We should have brought your computer so we could show them.
You know.
Oh well, check the file folders.
And so 5 values across the top. Confidence was one of them. So it would have student's name, confidence. And then whichever kid was holding my values board, I would say, okay, Alexis, confidence point, and they would put a tally mark in that box. And I think that really made things easier for me because I would find myself shouting out kids for a certain value and then kind of forgetting other values. Like curiosity, I just remember forgetting about that for about 3 weeks. But it was a helpful visual reminder to have the board in front of me and see that all the tally marks were, corresponded to one value and then the other value was left blank. So that was just my cue to start looking for people who are showing curiosity now, and that I could kind of lay off.
So you had a student who was in charge of the values points clipboard, and you would tell them when to give a values point to a student and under what value to give it to them.
Mm-hmm. Usually I would tell them, but sometimes I would say something like, okay, give out 3 control points. And that was pretty exciting because then they could look for the students who were basically showing the behavior that I wanted to see, and the student leader could then take responsibility and give out their own points.